Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing Day 12, Inheritance in C++. Inheritance is one of the most important concepts in object-oriented programming, and to be specific, inheritance is where we're able to have a given child class inherit the attributes and instance methods of a given parent class. And this is normally used in production to reduce code duplication. So for example, in this task, we're given two classes, person and student, where person is the parent class and student is the child class. So in this case, we're very lucky that HackerRank given us the full completed blueprint or class for person. And we're also given an incomplete class of student, and we have to do two things. The first thing is to implement a constructor that takes in 4 parameters. And in this case, this constructor has one additional integer array parameter as compared to the parent constructor. The second is to implement an additional instance method, calculate, that returns back a character with respect to the average scores that is contained inside this integer array over here. So in this case, as usual, we do not have to care about the input because HackerRank is very nice to implement the boilerplate for us. So with that, let's get started. The first step is to define the constructor for this student class. And as we discussed in the previous challenges, the constructor is always the name of the class itself. And in this case, this student constructor will take in 4 parameters. The first parameter is a string of a first name, string of a last name, integer of an ID, and finally a vector of an integer called scores. And in this case, on top of that, we can leverage one feature of inheritance, which is to call the constructor of the parent class instead. And just like that, we can reuse the code on line 14 to line 16 to set the 3 attributes, first name, last name, and ID. So for us to do that, we can put a colon after the constructor and specify the parent constructor instead. So in this case, the parent is person. And in this case, because the person constructor takes in 3 parameters, first name, last name, and scores, we can channel the parameters on line 38 inside the student constructor into the parent constructor. So we'll pass in first name, last name, and ID. And just like that, by reusing the inherited constructor, we reduce code duplication, and that is specifically the 3 lines on line 14 to line 16 to set the 3 attributes, first name, last name, and ID. So the final step would just be to set this current student's test scores attribute to scores over here. And with that, we're done with the implementation of the constructor. The next step is to define the instance method, calculate. So in this case, calculate will return back a character, so we'll make it return a character with no input parameters to this instance method. So the first step will be to define the sum of all scores inside these test scores, and we'll be dividing this by the size of the test scores vector to get the average of this student's score. So let's quickly define a sum integer, and we will use a simple for loop to get the scores in every single element. So score, and we will iterate the test scores like this. So for every single score, we will just increment it into sum. And the next step is to define a simple average. And let's set this to be equal to sum divided by the size of test scores. So that's pretty much it. And from this point onwards, I will go a little faster because we'll be doing just a couple of if-else statements that we are already comfortable with from the past challenges. So with that, let's quickly compare if average is more than or equals to 90. This is for the first branch. If that's the case, we return the letter O. Else if average is more than or equals to 80, this is the second branch, we will return E. Else if average is more than or equals to 70, then in this case we will return A. Else if average is more than or equals to 55, we will return P. Else if average is more than or equals to 40, then we return D. Else, in this case, by elimination, by this branch, the score will be less than 40 and return back T. So let's run this against some of the test cases. This pass, Let's submit this with the others 8 test cases, and this passed as well. So in summary, we learned how we can define our own constructor for the child class. In this case, this would override the given constructor. And we also learned how we can call the parent constructor that is inherited to reduce code duplication. And in this case, to be specific, we leverage the parent's constructor to set the first name, last name, and ID attribute. Finally, we also define our own instance method to add on top of all inherited instance methods from person. So with that, that's pretty much it for this question. So if you find this useful, please give us a like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next challenge.